Words have power. The language we use can shape how we perceive the world, influence our beliefs, and guide our decision-making processes. Two linguistic techniques that play a crucial role in shaping public opinion are loaded language and framing. These tools are commonly used in politics, media, advertising, and social discourse to subtly or overtly influence how we interpret events, policies, products, and even people. Loaded language refers to words or phrases that carry strong emotional connotations, either positive or negative, beyond their literal meanings. These words are loaded with persuasive value, often intended to provoke a specific emotional response in the listener. For example, calling someone a freedom fighter versus a terrorist can dramatically change the perception of the same person, even if the underlying facts about their actions remain the same. Loaded language is often used to manipulate feelings, evoke empathy or outrage, and sway opinions without providing concrete evidence. Framing, on the other hand, involves the way information is presented or structured. It's not just about what is said, but how it's said. Framing can influence how people interpret information by highlighting certain aspects of an issue while downplaying others. For example, describing a tax increase as investing in our future rather than raising taxes can shape whether people view the policy positively or negatively. Framing doesn't change the facts, but it changes the context in which the facts are understood. While both loaded language and framing can be used to enhance communication and simplify complex issues, they can also be wielded as tools of manipulation, steering people's opinions and beliefs without their conscious awareness. When we are unaware of the subtle influence of language and framing, we become vulnerable to being swayed by emotional appeals or one-sided presentations of information. In this video, we will explore the psychology behind loaded language and framing, the ways they are used in various sectors of society, and how to recognize and resist their manipulative effects. By understanding these tools, we can become more discerning consumers of information and better equipped to make informed decisions. Chapter 1. The Power of Loaded Language. Loaded language operates by tapping into our emotions, values, and instincts, allowing speakers or writers to evoke powerful reactions without providing substantive evidence. The strategic use of emotionally charged words can sway public opinion, create associations, and guide people's thinking. Emotional triggers and connotations. At the heart of loaded language is its ability to trigger emotional responses. Words like freedom, justice, or hero carry positive emotional connotations, while words like enemy, traitor, or terrorist provoke fear or anger. These words aren't neutral, they are imbued with meaning that goes beyond their dictionary definitions. For example, consider the difference between the terms reform and cutbacks. Both can refer to changes in policy, but reform suggests progress, improvement, and positive change, while cutbacks implies reductions, loss, and sacrifice. A politician advocating for reducing government spending might choose to frame the changes as reforms to evoke a positive reaction, even though the changes may involve reducing services or benefits. Similarly, consider the loaded language used in debates about social issues. Terms like pro-life or pro-choice carry heavy emotional weight, with each phrase designed to frame the issue in a way that aligns with certain values and beliefs. Pro-life emphasizes the sanctity of life, while pro-choice emphasizes individual autonomy. The terms themselves are loaded with implications that shape how people perceive the debate, even before the actual arguments are made. Euphemisms and dysphemisms. Another aspect of loaded language involves the use of euphemisms and dysphemisms. Euphemisms are mild or neutral words used to soften the impact of something unpleasant, while dysphemisms are harsh or derogatory terms used to intensify negative perceptions. For example, using the term collateral damage instead of civilian casualties is a euphemism that downplays the human cost of military action. It makes the loss of innocent lives sound like an unfortunate side effect, rather than a tragedy. On the other hand, referring to an environmental activist as an eco-terrorist is a dysphemism designed to frame their actions in the most negative light possible, even if those actions are peaceful. Euphemisms and dysphemisms are powerful tools because they shape our emotional responses to situations without changing the underlying facts. By carefully choosing words that minimize or magnify certain aspects of reality, speakers can steer how we feel about the issue at hand. Labels and identity. Loaded language is also often used in the form of labels to define individuals or groups. These labels can shape identity and influence how others perceive a person or group. For example, calling someone a patriot versus a radical can dramatically alter how they are seen, even if their actions are the same. Political discourse is rife with loaded labels. Terms like liberal or conservative can carry different meanings depending on who is using them and in what context. A person might proudly identify as a liberal in one context, but in another, the word might be used pejoratively to suggest someone is naive or unrealistic. Similarly, the term conservative can be used to imply either wisdom and caution or inflexibility and resistance to change. These labels are more than just descriptive terms. They are loaded with connotations that influence how we judge the people or groups being described. Chapter 2. Framing and the Power of Presentation. While loaded language relies on emotional triggers, framing is all about shaping the context in which information is presented. It doesn't change the facts themselves, but it changes how we interpret them by emphasizing certain aspects and downplaying others. Framing and perception. Framing influences how we perceive issues by altering the lens through which they are viewed. It's the difference between saying, "We need to cut taxes to stimulate growth," and "we need to reduce government revenue to shrink public services." Both statements may describe the same policy, but the framing changes the perception of the issue. In politics, framing is frequently used to sway public opinion on contentious issues. For example, consider the debate over immigration. One side might frame the issue as protecting our borders and emphasize the need for security and control. The other side might frame it as supporting human rights and focus on compassion and inclusivity. Both sides are talking about immigration, but the framing dramatically changes how the issue is perceived. Loss and gain framing. A common type of framing involves presenting information in terms of losses or gains. Research shows that people tend to be more motivated by the fear of loss than by the potential for gain, a phenomenon known as loss aversion. This means that how an issue is framed, in terms of what we stand to lose versus what we stand to gain, can significantly impact our decisions. For example, in healthcare policy debates, a proposal to change a program might be framed as saving taxpayer money, gain framing, or as taking away benefits, loss framing. Even if the policy is the same, focusing on the potential loss of benefits can evoke a stronger emotional reaction, leading people to oppose the change more strongly than they might if it were framed in terms of cost savings. Similarly, in marketing, companies often use loss framing to encourage customers to take action. A promotion might say, "Don't miss out on this limited time offer," instead of "Get this great deal." The emphasis on loss, missing out, is more likely to spur action than the emphasis on gain, getting a deal. The agenda-setting function of framing. Framing isn't just about individual words or phrases, it's also about the overall structure and focus of the message. This is known as the agenda-setting function of framing, where certain aspects of an issue are highlighted while others are minimized or ignored. For example, in media coverage of a protest, one news outlet might focus on the violence or property damage caused by a few individuals, while another outlet might focus on the peaceful demands of the majority of protesters. Both are reporting on the same event, but the framing shapes how the audience perceives the protest. By focusing on certain aspects of the story, the media can frame the issue in a way that aligns with their audience's beliefs or the outlet's agenda. Chapter 3. The use of loaded language and framing in politics. Politics is one of the arenas where loaded language and framing are most commonly and effectively used. Political leaders, parties, and interest groups often rely on these linguistic tools to shape public opinion, define their opponents, and promote their policies. Framing policy issues. In political campaigns and debates, framing is frequently used to present policies in a way that resonates with voters' values and emotions. For example, a proposal to raise taxes on the wealthy might be framed as asking the rich to pay their fair share, emphasizing fairness and equality. Opponents of the policy might frame it as punishing success, focusing on the idea that the policy discourages hard work and innovation. Both framings tap into different sets of values. One appeals to fairness and collective responsibility, while the other appeals to individualism and meritocracy. By framing the same policy in different ways, political leaders can influence which values voters prioritize when making decisions. Framing opponents. Framing isn't just used to promote policies, it's also used to undermine political opponents. One common tactic is to frame an opponent as out of touch or extreme, using loaded language to create a negative image. For example, a candidate might describe their opponent as radical or dangerous, framing them as a threat to stability, even if the opponent's policies are relatively mainstream. In some cases, political leaders use framing to delegitimize entire groups of people. For example, a politician might frame certain voters as the elite or the establishment, suggesting that they are disconnected from the concerns of ordinary citizens. On the other hand, they might frame their own supporters as the real people or the silent majority, suggesting that their views are more authentic or representative. This type of framing creates a sense of division and opposition, reinforcing an us versus them mentality that can be highly effective in mobilizing support, even if it oversimplifies complex issues. Nationalism and patriotism. Loaded language is also a powerful tool in promoting nationalism and patriotism. Politicians often use terms like freedom, security, loyalty, and tradition to frame their policies as beneficial to the nation's well-being, while framing their opponents as threats to national unity or security. For example, a politician advocating for stricter immigration policies might frame the issue in terms of protecting our way of life or defending our borders. These phrases are loaded with emotional weight and suggest that failure to adopt these policies will lead to a loss of national identity or safety. On the other side, opponents might frame the same issue in terms of upholding human rights or welcoming diversity, emphasizing compassion and inclusivity. Both sides are using loaded language to appeal to the values and emotions of their supporters, framing the issue in a way that aligns with their broader political goals. Chapter 4: Loaded Language and Framing in Media. The media plays a crucial role in shaping public opinion, and the way news is presented can significantly influence how people interpret events and issues. Through loaded language and framing, media outlets can shape narratives in ways that align with their editorial stances, often without viewers or readers being fully aware of the manipulation. The power of headlines. One of the most obvious ways that loaded language and framing are used in the media is through headlines. Headlines are designed to grab attention and summarize the story in a few words, but the choice of those words can dramatically influence how the story is perceived. For example, consider the difference between these two headlines about the same event. Protesters demand justice after police shooting versus rioters clash with police after fatal incident. Both headlines describe the aftermath of a police shooting, but the framing is entirely different. The first headline focuses on the demands for justice and frames the protesters as seeking a legitimate response to an injustice. The second headline focuses on the violence of the clash and frames the protesters as rioters, implying lawlessness and chaos. This type of framing is common in media coverage, where the same event can be presented in different ways depending on the outlet's editorial stance. The language used in headlines sets the tone for the story and primes the audience to interpret the event through a particular lens, framing through story structure. In addition to headlines, the structure of a news story can also shape how the audience interprets the information. The order in which facts are presented, the sources that are quoted, and the emphasis placed on certain details all contribute to the overall framing of the story. For example, a news story about a political scandal might begin by emphasizing the legal consequences and public outrage, framing the issue as a serious breach of trust. Alternatively, the story could start by focusing on the politicians' denial and their defense of their actions, framing the issue as a misunderstanding or overreaction. The framing of a story is often subtle, but it has a powerful impact on how the audience interprets the information. By structuring the story in a certain way, the media can shape the narrative to align with their perspective, even if the underlying facts remain the same. Bias and framing. It's important to note that framing doesn't necessarily mean that the media is lying or presenting false information. Rather, it involves emphasizing certain aspects of the story while downplaying others. This can create a form of bias where the audience is nudged toward a particular interpretation without being fully aware of the influence. For example, a news outlet that supports a particular political party might frame stories about that party's policies in a positive light, highlighting the benefits and downplaying the drawbacks. Meanwhile, stories about the opposing party's policies might be framed in a more negative light, focusing on the potential risks or failures. This type of bias is common in media coverage, and it's often difficult for the audience to detect because the framing feels natural. However, by being aware of how framing works, we can become more critical consumers of news and recognize when we are being subtly influenced by the way information is presented. Chapter 5. Loaded language and framing in advertising. Advertising is another field where loaded language and framing are used extensively to shape consumer behavior. Advertisers carefully choose their words and structure their messages to evoke positive emotions, create a sense of urgency, and frame their products in the best possible light. Creating positive associations. One of the primary goals of advertising is to create positive associations between the product and the consumer. This is often achieved through the use of loaded language that evokes feelings of happiness, success, or fulfillment. For example, a luxury car commercial might use words like elegance, power, and freedom to frame the car as a symbol of success and independence. These words are loaded with positive connotations and create an emotional appeal that goes beyond the car's actual features. The advertiser is not just selling a vehicle, they are selling an idea of what the vehicle represents. Similarly, advertisers often use euphemisms to soften the impact of negative information. For example, a food product that is high in sugar might be described as naturally sweetened rather than sugary, framing the product in a more positive light. Loss. Framing in advertising. As mentioned earlier, loss framing is a powerful tool in advertising where the fear of missing out, FOMO, is used to encourage consumers to take action. Advertisers often frame their promotions in terms of what consumers will lose if they don't act quickly, rather than focusing on what they stand to gain. For example, a clothing store might advertise a sale with the message, "Hurry before it's gone." This creates a sense of urgency and taps into the fear of loss, encouraging consumers to buy now rather than risk missing out on the deal. Even if the sale isn't particularly significant, the framing makes it feel more important. Framing the competition. In addition to framing their own products positively, advertisers also use framing to undermine the competition. This often involves comparing their product to a competitor's in a way that emphasizes the competitor's weaknesses while downplaying their own. For example, a phone company might frame their product as the fastest on the market, while framing their competitor's product as outdated or slow. The language used creates a stark contrast between the two products, even if the actual differences are minimal. By framing the competition in a negative light, advertisers can steer consumers toward their own product. Chapter 6. The dangers of loaded language and framing. While loaded language and framing can be used to enhance communication and simplify complex issues, they also carry significant risks. When used manipulatively, these tools can distort reality, mislead the public, and deepen divisions within society. Distorting the truth. One of the most significant dangers of loaded language and framing is that they can distort the truth. By using emotionally charged language or framing information in a particular way, speakers or writers can manipulate how people perceive the facts without ever lying outright. For example, a politician might frame a policy change as giving people more freedom, when in reality, the change might reduce certain protections or benefits. The loaded language of freedom evokes a positive emotional response, but it obscures the actual impact of the policy. Similarly, Framing a news story in a way that emphasizes certain details while ignoring others can create a skewed understanding of the issue. Even if the facts themselves are accurate, the framing can lead to a biased interpretation that doesn't reflect the full complexity of the situation. Manipulating emotions. Loaded language is particularly effective at manipulating emotions, which can override rational decision-making. When people are presented with information that taps into their fears, hopes, or values, they are more likely to make decisions based on those emotions rather than carefully considering the facts. For example, during election campaigns, candidates often use loaded language to evoke fear or anger about their opponents. By framing the opponent as a threat to the nation's security or values, they can rally their supporters to vote against the opponent, even if the actual policies are not as extreme as the language suggests. Deepening divisions. Loaded language and framing can also deepen divisions within society by reinforcing in-group and out-group mentalities. When issues are framed in terms of us versus them, it becomes harder for people to engage in constructive dialogue or find common ground. For example, political rhetoric that frames one group as the enemy or the problem can create an environment where compromise and collaboration are seen as weaknesses. This type of framing encourages people to see those who disagree with them as fundamentally different or dangerous, leading to increased polarization and social conflict. Undermining critical thinking. Finally, the use of loaded language and framing can undermine critical thinking by making it harder for people to evaluate information objectively. When we are bombarded with emotionally charged language or one-sided framing, it becomes difficult to step back and assess the situation rationally. For example, if a news outlet consistently frames certain political issues in a way that aligns with their editorial stance, viewers may start to accept that framing without questioning it. Over time, this can lead to a narrow view of the world, where people are less likely to seek out alternative perspectives or consider the complexity of the issues. Conclusion: how to recognize and resist loaded language and framing. Loaded language and framing are powerful tools that shape how we perceive the world, often without us realizing it. While they can enhance communication and simplify complex issues, they can also be used to manipulate emotions, distort the truth, and reinforce biases. Recognizing loaded language and framing. The first step in resisting the influence of loaded language and framing is to become more aware of how they are used. Pay attention to the words and phrases that are chosen, and ask yourself, are these words emotionally charged? If a word or phrase evokes a strong emotional response, it may be loaded language designed to influence how you feel about the issue. How is the issue being framed? Consider whether the information is being presented in a way that emphasizes certain aspects while downplaying others. Is the framing designed to steer you toward a particular interpretation? Seeking multiple perspectives. To counter the effects of loaded language and framing, it's important to seek out multiple perspectives on an issue. By exposing yourself to different viewpoints, you can gain a more balanced understanding and avoid being swayed by one-sided framing. Practicing critical thinking. Finally, practicing critical thinking is key to resisting manipulation. When you encounter emotionally charged language or framed information, take a step back and evaluate the facts. Ask yourself whether the framing aligns with the evidence and be wary of making decisions based solely on emotional appeals. By becoming more aware of how language and framing shape our perceptions, we can make more informed decisions and resist the influence of manipulative tactics in politics, media, and everyday life.
Remember to like and subscribe for more video content. Sapiens quae vigilat.